day 1022 of the Trump administration, and we have major breaking news. Our MSNBC colleague Rachel Maddow and the Washington Post have obtained a pre-publication look at the much-anticipated book titled A Warning by Anonymous. The book is due out November 19th. It's written by, quote, a senior official in the Trump administration, the same unnamed author of that September 2018 New York Times opinion column titled, I Am Part of the Resistance Inside the Trump Administration. The experts offer one person's view of what it's like to be in the administration. NBC News has not seen nor been able to confirm the contents of what's being reported tonight. The excerpts describe a cabal the author refers to as a steady state within the administration. Quote, President Trump should not be shocked that wary aides and cabinet members saved his presidency. My colleagues have done so many times. He should be worried. We should all be worried that these reasonable professionals are vanishing. With every dismissal or departure of a level-headed senior leader, the risks to the country grow, and the president is validated by a shrinking cadre of advisors who abet or encourage his bad behavior. We are already seeing the consequences. Another section of the book goes into detail about how the president must be briefed. Quote, it took a lot of trial and error for West Wing staff to realize there needed to be a change in the White House briefing process. Until that happened, officials would walk out of briefings frustrated. He is the most distracted person I've ever met, one of the president's security lieutenants confessed. He has no effing clue about what we're talking about. The anonymous author also wrote, why do people stay? A close friend asked me at the time, you should all quit. He's a mess. That's why, I responded, because he's a mess. It was true for a lot of us. We thought we could keep it together. The Washington Post's Phil Rucker, who joins us in a moment, has read A Warning. Tonight, he quotes the author as saying, senior Trump administration officials considered resigning en masse last year in a midnight self-massacre to sound a public alarm about President Trump's conduct, but rejected the idea because they believed it would further destabilize an already teetering government. Another quote describes Trump careening from one self-inflicted crisis to the next, like a 12-year-old in an air traffic control tower, pushing the buttons of government indiscriminately, indifferent to the planes skidding across the runway and the flights frantically diverting away from the airport. The Post includes another quote about what it's like inside the White House when the president tweets. Quote, it's like showing up at the nursing home at daybreak to find your elderly uncle running pantsless across the courtyard and cursing loudly about the cafeteria food as worried attendants try to catch him. You're stunned, amused, and embarrassed all at the same time. Only your uncle probably wouldn't do it every single day. His words aren't broadcast to the public, and he doesn't have to lead the U.S. government once he puts his pants on. Here for our leadoff discussion on a Thursday night, Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, Jill Colvin, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and co-author of the book Impeachment and American History. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for being here. Phil, you have read this book. What is it, other than a collection of anecdotes that very colorfully describe what the author says people are experiencing in the White House, what would viewers learn from it that we may not already know?
Yeah, well, Ali, it's a pretty chilling portrait that the author paints of President Trump up close in office, as corrupt, as inept. The author says the president is a danger to the country that he was elected to lead. And that's an alarming statement coming from somebody who is described as a senior administration official. We should point out that I don't know the identity of this official. The publisher and the book author's agents apparently have confirmed the identity, but that is not public information. But in totality, the book is a really damning indictment of this presidency and this president, and describes the extent to which aides in the government, especially in the national security and intelligence realms, were working to try to thwart the president's worst impulses, to try to protect the country as they saw it from some of the president's more dangerous ideas.
Phil, you and Peter and Jill report on this every day. Were there things in the book that surprised even you?
You know, the book Other books about the Trump presidency have been reported sort of collections of anecdotes. Mm-hmm. This book is more of an observation, of a commentary on what it's like inside the government. The author actually writes at the beginning of the book that he or she watered down a lot of the scenes, sort of stripped details from these anecdotes in order to protect his or her identity. So what you're not going to find in the book is sort of a page turner of every day what the president was saying, but rather you're going to just find alarming statements about the president's conduct and his behavior and his character, his morality, his fitness for office, his mental acuity, and on and on and on.
Jill, I want to play for you various things that Donald Trump has said about this editorial and this author.
We have somebody in what I call the failing New York Times that's talking about he's part of the resistance within the Trump administration. An anonymous editorial. Can you believe it? Anonymous, meaning gutless, a gutless editorial.
An anonymous, really an anonymous, gutless coward. You just look. But for the sake of our national security, the New York Times should publish his name at once.
We should find out who it is, because why should we live with somebody in the White House who is really subversive in a sense? I mean, if you look at it, it really is subversive.
Jill, subversive for the sake of our national security, the New York Times should publish their name at once. This, by the way, has remarkable parallels to the whistleblower story that we're in right now. But this seems to be an attack that the president is used to. Is this view shared by others in the White House?
Look, this originally the op-ed and now the book, this individual clearly got under the president's skin. You know, right after the publishing of that anonymous article, there was what I would arguably describe as probably the most intense hunt in the White House trying to figure out the identity of that person. They were never able to figure that out. From my understanding, they don't know at this point who that is. But what that prevents the president from doing is using his usual playbook. You know, just as you said, we're seeing that play out right now with the whistleblower. We saw that play out during the Mueller investigation. What the president likes to do, what this White House likes to do, is to be able to attack the messenger. They love to be able to dig up dirt. They love to be able to suggest that the person, you know, is a Democrat, is against them, is part of some deep state conspiracy. And when they don't know the name of that person, they're not able to effectively do that kind of smear job that they're so used to doing.
Peter, you're not here representing the New York Times' arrangement with this person or the deal, but the president attacks the very veracity of this, the integrity of the entire process. He calls it anonymous, gutless, coward. There is a journalistic history to protecting the anonymity of people for purposes that are said to serve the public interest.
Well, that's exactly right. And I would add, as to your point and to Phil's point, like Phil, I don't know who this person is. The New York Times editorial page does. They're the ones who published his piece or her piece a year ago. But the newsroom does not know. At least I don't know. The White House team does not know. We're separate in our organization. But I think you're right. I mean, the reasoning I think that the editorial page people gave was that, like the times when we use anonymous sources to provide important information for our readers, they thought that this was an exception to the rule where we normally, in fact, do identify the writers of op-ed pieces, that the character and the nature of the things that this writer was talking about were of sufficient importance to alert the public. Clearly, the publishers feel the same way. Now, it's a bit of a stunt, obviously. Having the name anonymous on the front is intended to get more attention, get us talking about it more, us speculating more on who it is. It will maybe sell more books that way. The author has said, apparently, that the reason, though, is in order to focus on Trump's actions rather than on, you know, the author, him or herself. But there will no doubt be a game playing for the next 2 or 3 weeks while we try to figure out what we can learn from this. It may be scrubbed enough, Phil knows better than I do, of enough details that we can't figure it out. But in 250 pages, my guess is there's just enough in there that people will start to narrow down a list and we'll play the guessing game of who it is.
The New York Times has just published a response from the anonymous author about why the author has decided to remain anonymous, and it reads as follows: "Removing my identity from the equation deprives him," meaning Trump, "of an opportunity to create a distraction," Anonymous writes, referring to Mr. Trump's compulsion for attacking his critics. Quote, "What will he do when there is no person to attack, only an idea?" Jill, that's a compelling case, because as we've seen again with the whistleblower, it has gone well beyond the whistleblower's allegations into things that have been proved, and yet the president stays on the whistleblower's identity. So Donald Trump does like to associate people with his criticisms.
Absolutely. And look, you've seen over the course of the last couple of weeks the president coming closer and closer to unmasking the identity of the whistleblower. We saw, the president's own son tweeting an article that claimed to publish the identity of the whistleblower. And you've seen when they, don't have that, on conservative media all day today, they were going after the whistleblower's lawyer, digging up, old tweets of his and using those to try to discredit that information. We've seen Republican allies of the president go after all of these individuals who have been testifying behind closed doors, even people who have served in Republican administrations going back decades, highly respected, generals, people who are really, according to a lot of folks, really beyond reproach. But this is the tactic that they found effective.
Phil, in reading the book, did you get a sense that this was Anonymous's way of getting this off their chest or delivering testimony, or is there something more purposeful in it? Is there a call to action with respect to Americans and Donald Trump?
Yeah, and Ali, there's a call to action for the American people. The author writes about the election coming up in 2020, and it's very clear that this author does not believe Trump should be reelected to office, and speaks about it that way. There's not necessarily a call to action for everyone serving in the government to suddenly resign or something of that nature. There's a discussion in the book about alleging that there was consideration of the 25th Amendment, invoking the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office, but it's described in the book in very vague detail without the sort of supportive evidence that we would look for as journalists. And it's been disputed, by the way, by the vice president. But rather, it's the author, I think, describing what he or she has experienced and felt in this administration and the alarm that he or she felt from the president's action, but also from this person's colleagues. The author writes several times that there are many people in the government at a senior level at the White House who share these concerns and these views about the president.
Peter Baker, one of the things that the author points out is the degree to which, over time, since the beginning of this administration, the ranks of the steady state, people like the author, has been thinned at the White House. And that leads one to conclude that the author believes that the protective net around the president, or the net that protects America from the president, is diminished.
Well, I think that's right. Exactly. The first generation of people, even the second generation of people who worked around this president are gone. This has been the highest turnover of any administration in modern times. And with each successive, installation of somebody in various cabinet positions or White House positions, you're finding a president who's looking for somebody to basically keep, let him be Trump, to let Trump be Trump. He has no longer as much patience for aides telling him what to do and what not to do, telling him this is the way things should be done and shouldn't be done. Clearly, that's a frustration for Anonymous, whoever he or she is. But this has raised a really interesting question. The question that's being debated within Washington and government circles is, at what point does a person who disagrees with the president so strenuously, who finds the president to be so radical and dangerous as this author does, at what point is it then incumbent on that person to leave the government and say so on the record with a name attached? Is it fair to a president, any president, to have somebody inside who disagrees with them so much and that they continue to do so in a quiet way? You're getting a really interesting debate about this, including from liberals and people who don't particularly like President Trump, who also say that this is not necessarily the best way to go about, mounting a resistance. You have the others who say, look, this is a patriot who believes in his or her country, is doing the best he or she can to keep things together with a mercurial commander-in-chief. So it's a really interesting time and really interesting debate that this has provoked.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.